The drumming of rain on the corrugated tin roof of the barracks at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was the only sound I could hear. Everything else was silent. On the platform, a major general I'd never seen before was holding a single sheet of paper. My paper. "Whoever wrote this," his voice cut through the humid air like a razor, "will see me in my office afterward." My heart hammered to a stop. My entire 12-year career felt like it was dissolving in the damp southern air. But then, the reason I'd done it came into sharp focus. I saw Private Roth's bruised face in my mind. I heard the jeering laughter from the latrine. And I heard Sergeant Major Vance's voice from yesterday morning when he'd looked at me with pure contempt and asked, "What's the matter, Lauren Kelly? That time of the month." That was the sentence. That was the humiliation that had put the pen in my hand. Next to me, Vance ground his teeth. His voice was a low hiss, just loud enough for me to hear. "Some son of a bitch is gonna pay for this." He had no idea the son of a bitch was the woman standing right beside him. And he was right. I knew I was about to pay a very high price. Every step from the parade ground to the command headquarters felt like my boots were filled with lead. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes boring into my back. The whispers had started, a low buzz like angry hornets that you could feel more than you could hear. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick enough to taste, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and dread. My dread. I walked past Captain Briggs. He didn't even look at me, didn't offer a word of support, or even a nod of acknowledgement. His gaze was fixed on some distant point only he could see, his jaw set like concrete. I knew that look. It was the look of a man doing rapid, silent calculations, figuring out how to throw me under the bus in the most efficient way possible, how to position himself as a loyal officer blindsided by a rogue NCO. He was already drafting the report in his head. Sergeant Major Vance was waiting at the door to the command suite, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his barrel chest. A smug, knowing smirk played on his lips. "Good luck," he drawled, the words dripping with the exact opposite sentiment. He was enjoying this. This was his system, his world, and I had dared to challenge it. My failure would be his victory. I didn't reply. I just clenched my fist inside my jacket pocket, my knuckles pressing hard against the fabric. I focused on that small, sharp pain. It was real. It was something to hold on to. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the room that would decide my fate. General Roth's office was vast and intimidatingly quiet. The air was heavy with the scent of old mahogany and worn leather, the smell of institutional power that had existed long before I was born and would exist long after I was gone. He sat behind his desk, a broad expanse of polished wood that looked like an aircraft carrier. He wasn't a man. He was a monument, an emperor on his throne. I snapped to attention, my back ramrod straight, my eyes fixed on the wall behind his head, preparing to receive my sentence. But then my eyes caught on the one thing that didn't belong. Amidst the perfectly aligned pens, the classified folders, and the military commendations, there was a single object that was purely civilian: a silver-framed photograph. It showed a 19-year-old kid in a black t-shirt for the Killers, his arm slung casually over the general's shoulders. They were both beaming, a genuine, unguarded happiness radiating from the picture. The kid had messy brown hair, that innocent, almost goofy grin that hadn't yet been hardened by the realities of the world. It was Evan Roth. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My chest constricted with a force so powerful I thought my ribs would crack. Every scenario I'd rehearsed in my head, every defense I'd prepared, every ounce of defiance I had mustered, it all evaporated into nothing. This changed everything. This was a complication I could never have imagined. The general gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit down, Sergeant." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It wasn't angry. It wasn't kind. It was just empty. It was the voice of a man about to perform a necessary, unpleasant task. I sat, my movements stiff and mechanical. My mind was racing, trying to piece together this impossible puzzle. "You wrote the letter," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I could only nod. "Yes, sir." You bypassed your entire chain of command, Sergeant. You went over the heads of your sergeant major and your captain. You know the protocol. Why? This was it, the moment of truth. My training screamed at me to be deferential, to apologize, to explain my lapse in judgment. But my conscience, the part of me that still remembered the terrified look in Evan's eyes, wouldn't let me. My eyes flicked from the picture of the smiling boy to the unreadable face of his father. I took a breath. Because, sir, with all due respect, the chain of command is part of the problem. The words hung in the silent room, a declaration of war. I watched Sergeant Major Vance look the other way. I heard Captain Briggs say he didn't want the paperwork hassle over a sensitive new private. Reporting to them, sir, would have been like reporting to that wall. The system is protecting itself, not its soldiers. I had laid it all on the line. My career, my pension, my entire identity as a soldier who believed in the uniform. It was all riding on that one honest answer. I expected rage. I expected to be dressed down, to be verbally torn to shreds for my insubordination. Instead of fury, General Roth just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A flicker of profound sadness crossed his eyes, a deep, weary sorrow that seemed to age him 10 years in a single second. He was my son, Sergeant. 3 words that tilted my world on its axis. My carefully constructed reality, where generals were judges and privates were victims, shattered into a million pieces. He was here under an assumed name, the general continued, his voice low and heavy. As part of an internal morale assessment I initiated myself. No one knew, not even your colonel. I was tired of polished reports and convenient statistics. I wanted to see the truth of what was happening to our youngest soldiers on the ground. And you? He paused, his eyes locking onto mine, a new intensity burning in them. Were the only one who showed it to me. He picked up my letter from his desk, holding it not like a piece of evidence, but like something precious. You saved him from something worse, Sergeant. Far worse. You did the right thing. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold dread when he spoke his next words. But you've also kicked a hornet's nest. Your fight isn't with me. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a serious, almost dangerous tone. It has only just begun. The general's final words hung in the air long after I'd left his office. It has only just begun. I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but it didn't take long to find out. News of my private meeting with General Roth spread through the base faster than a wildfire. No one knew the details, of course. The military is an organism that thrives on secrecy and speculation. But they didn't need the details. All they knew was that I, a staff sergeant, had been called into the general's office after an anonymous letter was read aloud, and that I had walked out with my career inexplicably intact. In their eyes, I had broken the golden rule. What goes on in the house stays in the house. I was a snitch. The atmosphere changed overnight. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was something colder, more insidious. The next day in the mess hall, I sat down at one of the long tables with my tray. The chatter, a familiar and constant hum of complaints about food and weekend plans, slowly died out around me. The young soldiers I'd mentored, privates whose marksmanship I'd personally corrected, suddenly found the pattern on the linoleum floor fascinating. They avoided my eyes. One of them, a kid named Peterson, needed the salt. He was sitting right next to me. Instead of asking, he reached across the table and gestured to another soldier, who then slid the salt shaker right past my plate to him, as if I were a ghost, a vacant space at the table. It was a systematic, silent shunning. It hurt more than any reprimand ever could. I was surrounded by hundreds of people in the same uniform as me, and I had never felt so completely alone. The next day, the retaliation became more direct. Sergeant Major Vance cornered me. He didn't do it in the office or on the training grounds. He called me into the supply depot, a place that was dimly lit and smelled of dust, canvas, and old cosmoline. As soon as I was inside, he slammed the heavy metal door shut, the sound echoing in the cramped space. "Think you're smart, don't you, Kelly?" he hissed. He stepped so close I could feel the heat coming off him, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and cigarettes. Think you're special because you got the general's attention? I stood my ground, my posture locked at parade rest. Let me tell you something, he said, poking a thick finger into the air between us. In this world, that doesn't make you protected. It makes you a target. He took a step back, his eyes raking over me with a look of pure disgust, as if I were something he'd scraped off his boot. You broke faith with these soldiers, with your unit. You're not one of us anymore. You're a problem. And problems, he paused, letting the threat hang in the dusty air, get solved. A shiver went down my spine, cold and sharp, but I refused to let him see it. I met his gaze without flinching and held it until he finally grunted in frustration and jerked the door open. I walked out, the unspoken threat clinging to me like the smell of motor oil. The final blow came that Friday night. The first Friday of every month, our unit had a traditional BBQ at the recreational area by the lake. It was an informal thing, a chance to unwind, drink a few beers, and build camaraderie. I was always there, usually the one flipping burgers on the grill, trading stories with the younger guys. But this week, no one told me about it. The email chain, the casual mentions in the hallway. I was left out of all of them. I only found out by accident when I was walking back from the motor pool and saw the twinkling string lights through the trees. I heard the familiar sound of a country rock playlist blasting from a portable speaker and the eruption of laughter. I stood in the shadows, hidden by a line of pine trees. I saw Captain Briggs, a bottle of Budweiser in his hand, laughing as he clapped Vance on the shoulder. I saw soldiers from my own platoon playing a sloppy game of volleyball under the floodlights. Not a single person looked my way. It was as if I had been surgically removed from the family photo. I watched them for a long time, feeling like a hungry kid staring through a restaurant window at a warm, happy family dinner I wasn't invited to. That feeling, that sting of being erased, was the sharpest pain of all. Defeated, I turned back toward the empty barracks, deciding to just go to the office and lose myself in a mountain of paperwork. The company headquarters was deserted, the silence broken only by the low hum of a fluorescent light overhead. As I was sorting through a stack of training reports, the door creaked open. It was Chief Warrant Officer Lam, the quiet second-generation Vietnamese-American woman who ran our records division. She was famously reserved, a woman of few words. She didn't say a thing. She simply walked over to my desk and placed a steaming ceramic mug of coffee beside my keyboard. She gave me a single, brief look. But it was a look of profound understanding. Then, just as silently, she turned and left. I stared at the mug for a moment, confused. Then I saw it. Tucked underneath was a small yellow sticky note. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up. Written in neat, precise handwriting was a single sentence. A tree that stands alone against the wind grows the deepest roots. It wasn't an order. It wasn't advice. It was acknowledgement. And in the crushing loneliness of that night, it was everything I needed. The anonymous support from Chief Lam was a single candle in a growing darkness. I knew the hornet's nest General Roth had warned me about was buzzing, and I didn't have to wait long for the first sting. It came in the form of a summons. A formal meeting with Captain Briggs and our battalion commander, Colonel Dunar. General Roth was not on the attendee list. This was their home turf. The conference room was cold, the air conditioning cranked up to an Arctic level that had nothing to do with the North Carolina heat. The air was thick with a hostility so palpable you could almost see it. They sat on one side of a long, polished veneer table that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights from above. I sat on the other, alone. Briggs began, his voice a carefully modulated monotone, as if he were reading an indictment. Staff Sergeant Kelly, your actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, have bypassed established protocols and undermined the chain of command. This sets a dangerous precedent. Colonel Dunar, a man with a stern face and impatient eyes, picked up the thread without missing a beat. His tone was patronizing, like a disappointed father scolding a child. We don't run an army on feelings, Sergeant. We run it on orders and discipline. Your personal judgment is not a substitute for the structure that holds this entire institution together. They weren't accusing me of a crime. They were lecturing me, carefully reframing my deliberate action as some kind of emotional, feminine outburst. They were trying to shrink me, to reduce my stand to a footnote in a file. I kept my hands clasped behind my back, my posture rigid, my voice even when I finally spoke. Sirs, I followed my conscience when I believed the system was failing to protect one of its own soldiers. My words were met with a stony silence. The meeting was over. It was never a discussion. It was a pronouncement. A few days later, the real attack began. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare. I received a notice for an unscheduled performance review. My entire record for the past 6 months was to be audited. The man assigned to conduct this audit was, of course, Sergeant Major Vance. He savored every moment of it. He sat in my office, poring over every document, every report, every single piece of paper with my name on it. He flagged a readiness report that I had filed 5 minutes past the deadline 3 months ago. He circled a single typo in a 20-page inventory memo. These were insignificant details that, in the normal course of operations, would have been completely ignored. Now, they were being documented with meticulous care, compiled into a growing dossier of my alleged incompetence. "Seems like your focus has been slipping lately, Kelly," Vance said, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, trying to look concerned. "Maybe a high-pressure, frontline role isn't the best fit for you anymore." I knew exactly what was happening. They weren't just retaliating. They were building a paper trail. They were creating a perfectly legal, officially documented excuse to remove me. The results of the review came swiftly. I wasn't demoted. I wasn't formally disciplined. That would have been too obvious, too open to appeal. Instead, I received new orders. Captain Briggs delivered them himself, though he couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes, focusing instead on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. "For the good of the unit," he said, the corporate speak sounding hollow and rehearsed, "you're being reassigned, effective immediately, to the Internal Archives and Logistics Division." It was a paper prison, a bureaucratic graveyard. It was the place they sent NCOs who were counting the days to retirement, or the ones command wanted to make disappear. My new office was a windowless room in the basement of the administration building, filled with rows of drab, gray metal filing cabinets that hadn't been opened since the Cold War. The air smelled of decaying paper and dust. My new job was to digitize decades-old personnel files. A solitary, mind-numbing, meaningless task designed to crush the spirit. They weren't firing me. They were burying me alive. As I packed my personal belongings from my desk into a single, standard-issue cardboard box, no one came to say goodbye. The soldiers I'd trained, the men and women I'd shared meals and miserable field exercises with, all found reasons to be somewhere else. I saw them from the corner of my eye, watching from a distance. A few looked guilty, but most just looked relieved. The problem was being solved. Carrying my box, I walked out of the company office for the last time. As I passed the hallway, I saw Briggs and Vance talking near the coffee machine. Briggs clapped Vance on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie. "Good work," Briggs said, his voice low but clear. "Things are back to normal now." Normal. The word echoed in my head as I walked down the sterile corridor. The abuse, the cover-ups, the cruelty, the silence. That was their normal. And I, the person who had tried to disrupt it, was the abnormality. An error to be filed away, locked in a drawer in the basement, and forgotten. To preserve their rotten peace. Weeks bled into one another in that windowless crypt. My world shrank to the monotonous hum of the industrial scanner, the dry, chemical scent of aging paper, and the endless rows of gray metal cabinets. Time ceased to have meaning. I was on the verge of accepting my fate, of finally believing that they had won. They had successfully erased me. Every day, like clockwork, Chief Warrant Officer Lamb would appear with a hot mug of coffee, placing it on the corner of my desk without a word. Her silent presence was my only link to the world above, a brief, 5-second reminder that I still existed. Her visits were a lifeline I hadn't even realized I was clinging to. Then, one afternoon, something changed. She placed the coffee down, but instead of leaving immediately, she hesitated. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely a whisper, just loud enough to cut through the scanner's drone. "Chief Morales in personnel," she said, her eyes fixed on the door behind me. "He's retiring at the end of the week. He knows things. Maybe you should talk to him before it's too late." It was the first piece of advice she had ever given me, and in the suffocating silence of my tomb, it felt like a rescue flare. I found Chief Warrant Officer Morales in his office later that day. He was surrounded by cardboard boxes in various states of being packed. Trophies were wrapped in newspaper, framed photos were stacked neatly on his desk, and a half-empty bottle of bourbon sat beside a coffee mug. He was a man in his late 50s, with kind, tired eyes that had seen too much bureaucracy, too many secrets. When I introduced myself, a long, weary sigh escaped his lips. "I know who you are, Sergeant," he said, not unkindly. He gestured to a stack of boxes as if to say, "See, I'm busy." At first, he refused to talk. "I'm 3 days from freedom, kid," he said, shaking his head. 3 days. I don't want any trouble." He started telling me about his wife, about their plans to move down to Florida, about a house they'd bought near the coast in Sarasota. He spoke of learning to fish, of walking on the beach every morning. He wasn't talking to me, he was trying to convince himself. He was reminding himself of the price of silence, and how that price was peace. I didn't give up. I let him finish, and then I changed the subject. I didn't talk about my career or what they'd done to me. I talked about Evan Roth. I described the bruises I'd seen on his face, the quiet terror in the kid's eyes that he tried so hard to hide. I told him how the other soldiers treated him like a stray dog they could kick for sport. Then I looked him straight in the eye. "Do you have a son, sir?" The question landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. It seemed to find a crack in his armor. He went silent for a long time, his hands frozen over a half-packed box. He turned his head and stared out the window at nothing in particular. "I do," he finally said, his voice raspy with an emotion he'd kept buried for years. "He served too. Went to Afghanistan." He swallowed hard. He saw things he shouldn't have. And the people in charge, they didn't listen. He turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw past the tired bureaucrat. I saw a father. He never really came back, not all of him. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken stories. I could see the war raging behind his eyes, the carefully constructed peace of his retirement versus the nagging, biting guilt of his conscience. Finally, he let out a shuddering breath, a sound of surrender, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally become too heavy to bear. "All right," he said softly. "All right." He walked over to a tall gray filing cabinet in the corner, one that was locked with a separate, non-standard padlock. He pulled a key from his personal keychain and opened it. The inside was almost empty, except for a single, thin folder. It was bright red. "These are the things that never make it into the official system," he explained, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The off-the-books complaints. The verbal reports that Captain Briggs ordered to be handled internally." He pulled the red folder out and laid it on his desk. Roth's name wasn't the first one. He opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a typed summary of a verbal complaint from another private, dated 6 months before Evan Roth had even arrived at Fort Bragg. It detailed the same kind of harassment, the same systematic bullying, by the same 2 specialists. "Briggs buried this," Morales said, his finger tapping the paper. "He knew. Vance knew. They knew this was happening long before your private ever showed up. They let it continue." He walked over to the copy machine, made a copy of the document, and walked back to me. He held it out. "Here," he said, his voice firm now. The weariness replaced by a spark of defiance. "Go do the right thing. The thing I wasn't brave enough to do." The copy of the complaint Chief Morales had given me was a bomb. But it was a bomb without a detonator. To truly bring the whole rotten structure down, I needed the original. I needed the red file itself. I knew it had to be somewhere in Captain Briggs's office, locked away in his filing cabinet. The question was, how could I possibly get to it? The answer once again came from the quiet wisdom of Chief Warrant Officer Lamb. The next morning, during her silent coffee delivery to my basement prison, she spoke. "The security camera in the command hallway has a blind spot," she said, her eyes never leaving the computer monitor she was pretending to inspect on a nearby desk. "Right in the corner, by the support pillar. The wiring's been faulty for years, but no one ever bothered to put in a work order." She paused, then added, "He has a base-wide security briefing every Thursday night, 2100 hours. His office will be empty." She didn't ask what I was planning. She didn't need to. She simply gave me an opportunity, a window. It was a quiet act of trust, a silent partnership forged in the face of corruption. I knew I couldn't let her down. Thursday night arrived with a heavy, humid stillness. I changed out of my uniform and into a set of dark sweats, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The base at night is a different world, a landscape of long shadows and strange, echoing sounds. Every rustle of leaves, every distant rumble of a truck, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I slipped into the command building, hugging the walls, my breath held tight in my chest every time I heard the faint sound of footsteps in a distant corridor. I found the blind spot Lamb had described, a perfect pocket of shadow cast by a thick concrete pillar. From there, I could see the door to Briggs's office, 50 feet down the hall. The corridor was empty. I moved quickly, silently, my sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. At the door, I pulled out the small lock-picking set I'd learned to use back in a basic intelligence course years ago, a skill I never thought I'd use. My hands were slick with sweat. The tiny metal tension wrench felt cold and alien in my trembling fingers. I inserted it into the lock, applying gentle pressure. Then I slid in the pick, feeling for the tumblers. The silence of the hallway was absolute, making every tiny scrape of metal, every soft click, sound like a gunshot in my ears. One pin set, then another. My heart was in my throat. Finally, after an eternity, I felt the last tumbler give way with a soft, final thunk. The lock was open. I slipped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and was plunged into near-total darkness. The only light, a faint glow from the parking lot lights outside his window. The room smelled of cheap, pine-scented air freshener, a cloying attempt to cover up the staleness of the office. Briggs's office was unnervingly neat, a sign of a man who valued appearance over substance. I didn't waste time. I went straight to the gray 4-drawer filing cabinet against the far wall. The label on the second drawer read, "Personnel Complaints, Resolved." My hand shook as I pulled the handle. The drawer slid open with a low, metallic groan that seemed to scream through the silent office. I thumbed through the manila folders, my eyes scanning the labels. And then I saw it. Tucked in the very back, just as Morales had described. A single folder made of bright red cardstock. I lifted it out. My breath hitched. Inside was the original complaint from the young private, far more detailed and damning than the copy I had. But it was the document stapled to the inside cover that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a bright yellow post-it note. There were 2 distinct sets of handwriting on it. The first was the angry, sharp scrawl of Sergeant Major Vance. "Briggs, take care of this. Don't let it go upstairs." And directly below it, in Captain Briggs's neat, precise cursive, "Handled, file for long-term storage." Followed by his signature, "Long-term storage." It was Army code, a euphemism for, bury this so deep it never sees the light of day again. They hadn't just ignored it. They hadn't just dismissed it. They had actively, knowingly conspired to conceal it. They knew. They knew about the abuse long before Evan Roth ever set foot on this base. And they let it continue. They chose their clean records over the safety of a soldier they were sworn to protect. An icy coldness spread through my veins, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was rage, a pure, clean, clarifying anger that burned away every last trace of doubt and hesitation. I pulled out my phone. The darkness of the office was shattered by the sharp, repeating flash as I took pictures of every page, every signature, every damning word on that yellow note. The flash illuminated the tiny dust particles dancing in the air, like the first stirrings of a coming storm. I had it. I had everything I needed. The silent war of whispers and shadows was over. It was time for the confrontation. The email from General Roth's office landed with the quiet authority of a court summons the next morning. It announced an emergency meeting for 900 hours. The subject line, a masterpiece of bureaucratic camouflage. Review of complaint processing procedures. It was the perfect trap, an invitation so mundane, so steeped in the language of administrative drudgery that no one could possibly refuse. By the general's direct order, I was in the conference room 15 minutes early. I stood in the corner, a silent sentinel in a cold, sterile room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and weak coffee. I watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep its unforgiving circle, each tick a hammer blow counting down to the moment of reckoning. I was not the same woman who had trembled before this command structure weeks ago. The fear was gone, burned away by the white-hot rage of a truth I now held in my hand. At 8:58, they began to arrive. Colonel Dunar entered first, his face a mask of stern impatience. He was followed by Captain Briggs, who walked with a self-important stride, his leather satchel swinging at his side. He was a man who believed he was on his way up. Sergeant Major Vance was last, sauntering in with a confident swagger, a smug smirk already playing on his lips as he prepared to endure another pointless staff meeting. Then they saw me. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. Vance's smirk didn't just vanish, it froze, cracked, and fell from his face. Briggs's forward momentum stalled, and he stopped so abruptly that Dunar almost bumped into him. His eyes, wide with alarm, darted from me to the empty chair at the head of the table and back again. He knew instinctively that he had just walked into an ambush. General Roth was the last to enter. He didn't slam the door, but he closed it with a quiet, deliberate click that sealed the room, turning it from a conference room into a cage. He took his seat and let the suffocating silence hang in the air for a long moment before speaking, his voice calm and even. "Captain Briggs," he began, "please update us on the current effectiveness of our internal complaint system." It was a testament to Briggs's political instincts that he recovered so quickly. He cleared his throat, straightened his uniform jacket, and launched into his prepared lies, completely oblivious to the fact that the jaws of the trap were already closing. "Sir, the system is robust and effective," he said, his voice regaining its smooth, confident tone. "It ensures that every soldier's concerns are heard and addressed in a timely and professional manner, maintaining full confidence in the chain of command." General Roth nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" he said, the question hanging in the air. He turned his gaze to me. "Staff Sergeant Kelly, perhaps you could provide us with a recent example of that effectiveness." That was my cue. I stepped forward from the corner, my movements measured and precise. I felt their eyes on me, burning with a mixture of confusion and hate. I connected my phone to the overhead projector. The screen flickered and the projector whirred to life. The first image I displayed was the cover of the bright red folder, the words, "Internal Review," stark against the crimson background. A collective, sharp intake of breath sucked the oxygen from the room. I saw Colonel Dunar shift uncomfortably in his chair. Briggs's face had gone completely pale. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. I said nothing. I let the evidence deliver the testimony. With a tap on my phone's screen, I moved to the next image. The detailed, desperate, typed-out complaint from the young private, dated 6 months prior. The room was so quiet I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. Next, the yellow post-it note, magnified to fill the entire wall. Vance's angry, jagged handwriting screamed from the screen. "Briggs, take care of this. Don't let it go upstairs." I saw Vance's knuckles turn white where he gripped the edge of the polished table. Then, the final image. The kill shot. Captain Briggs's neat, self-assured cursive, right below Vance's scrawl, "Handled. File for long-term storage." And beneath it, his unmistakable signature. I let the image burn into the wall, a digital scar branding them for their sins. Then I turned off the projector and stepped back into the shadows, my work done. General Roth turned his head, his gaze landing on Briggs with the force of a physical blow. His voice was no longer calm. It was as cold and sharp as broken glass. "Captain," he asked, the words slicing through the silence, "what is your definition of heard? Is it burying a young soldier's cry for help to keep your own promotion file clean?" Briggs's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was flailing, his composure shattered into a million pieces. "Sir, that was an internal disciplinary matter. I was trying to protect the unit's cohesion." He was spouting the empty, meaningless jargon of a man with no honor left. Vance remained silent, his face a mask of crimson rage and pure, uncut humiliation. He had been outmaneuvered, exposed, and he had no one to blame but himself. "Enough," General Roth commanded. His voice wasn't a shout, but it had the force of a thunderclap, silencing Briggs instantly. He stood up, his chair scraping back harshly, and began to pace slowly behind the three officers, his presence a looming storm. "The strength of this army is not measured in perfect reports or clean records," he said, his voice ringing with a righteous fury that seemed to shake the very walls. "It is measured in trust. The sacred trust that when a soldier is in danger, their leaders will listen. That when they are hurting, their leaders will protect them. You," he said, his gaze sweeping over them like a fire, "have betrayed that trust for your own convenience." He stopped directly behind Briggs, who sat frozen, staring straight ahead. Staff Sergeant Kelly violated protocol, it's true. Her actions did not endanger a single life. Her actions did not damage a single piece of government property. Roth leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper meant for everyone to hear. "The only thing endangered here, Captain, was your pride." He straightened up and turned to me, and the hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of profound respect. "You did what a soldier is supposed to do," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You put your teammate before your career. That is honor." The room was as silent as a grave. The war was over. After the meeting, I didn't go back to the basement. I didn't go anywhere. I just walked, aimlessly. The storm had broken, leaving the North Carolina air feeling scrubbed clean and cool. The scent of rain-soaked pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I had won. Briggs and Vance were finished. Justice, in its own brutal, bureaucratic way, had been served. But I didn't feel victorious. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of vindication. There was just a hollow space, an unnerving quiet in my own head. The anger, the fear, the white-hot determination, the fuel that had propelled me forward for weeks, had all burned away. All that was left was ash. The war was over, and I suddenly didn't know who I was without an enemy to fight. My entire adult life had been defined by two things. First, serving the system, and then fighting it. Now, both crusades were finished. The silence that remained was deafening. I got in my car and drove, the motions automatic. I ended up in downtown Fayetteville at the Airborne and Special Operations Museum. I paid my admission and wandered through the halls, a ghost among ghosts. I walked past displays of dusty green uniforms, of silk parachutes hanging like specters from the ceiling, of handwritten letters sent home from forgotten wars. I stopped in front of the black and white photographs, staring into the young, determined faces of men from World War II, from Korea, from Vietnam. They had believed in it too. In the honor of the uniform, in the loyalty of the chain of command, in the fundamental rightness of the system they served. They had trusted it with their lives. How many of them had been betrayed, not by an enemy bullet, but by the quiet indifference of the man standing next to him? How many stories like Evan Roth's had been buried in silence, lost to time, with no one to write a letter, no general to intervene? A profound sadness washed over me, a sorrow that was bigger than my own story. It was for them. For all the soldiers who had suffered in silence, for all the ones who never had a General Roth to have their back. I had been one of the lucky ones. I found a quiet bench in the Vietnam exhibit and sat down, the weight of the last few weeks finally crashing down on me. I was exhausted, not just in body, but in my soul. I closed my eyes and my phone buzzed in my pocket. A blocked number. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let the world and all its demands just fade away. But something made me answer. Hello? Staff Sergeant Kelly? The voice was hesitant, both familiar and strange. It had lost the frightened edge I remembered. It's Evan. My eyes snapped open. I sat up straight. Evan, are you all right? Where are you? I'm okay, Sergeant. I'm on a bus. They've reassigned me. I'm on my way to officer candidate school. He paused and I could hear the rumble of the road through the phone. He was calling to say one thing. I wanted to say thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't look away. You didn't give up on me. You showed me what a real soldier is supposed to be. We didn't talk for long. We didn't need to. But that short, simple call was like a ray of sunlight breaking through a thick layer of clouds. It was a stark reminder of what this had all been about. Beyond the fight with the system, beyond the bureaucratic maneuvering and the ugly power plays, there was a person. A 19-year-old kid who had been protected. A good kid who was now on his way to becoming a leader himself. That night, I drove out to Smith Lake on base. The water was perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting the infinite blanket of stars above. The air was cool and quiet. I sat on the edge of a wooden dock, my legs dangling over the dark water, and I knew I had a choice to make. Two roads stretched out before me. I could put in my papers, leave the Army, and take my 20-year retirement a few years early. I could walk away with the bitterness and disillusionment, find a quiet life back in Ohio, and try to forget. Or I could stay. I could stay and try to turn this small, bloody victory into something meaningful. I could try to be the kind of leader the Army needed, the kind I had so rarely seen. I thought of the note from Chief Lamb. I thought of the gratitude in Evan's voice. Small things, quiet acts of courage and decency that had kept me going when everything seemed lost. It's funny how, in our darkest moments, it's never the grand speeches that save us. It's a cup of coffee, a quiet word, a phone call from a kid on a bus. It makes me wonder about you, the person listening to my story right now. Think about a time you felt completely alone, like you were fighting a battle no one else could see. Who was your Evan or your Chief Lamb? If you feel comfortable, please support this story with a like, and comment below with just one word that describes the person who gave you the strength to keep going. A name, a title, like mom, friend, or mentor. Let's fill the comments with a reminder of the quiet heroes in our own lives. I thought of a verse from the Bible my grandmother used to recite whenever I was scared as a little girl. Psalm 23. I'm not a religious person, not really. But her voice came back to me as clear as if she were sitting right there beside me on the dock. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I had walked through that valley, and I realized I hadn't been alone. I took a deep breath of the cool night air. I would stay, not for the system, not for the uniform, but for the soldiers like Evan, and for the quiet heroes like Chief Lamb. My fight was just beginning. A few days after my decision at the lake, I received a call. It wasn't a summons barked over the phone by a sergeant. It was from the general's aide-de-camp, and his tone was polite, almost formal. It wasn't an order, it was an invitation. General Roth was inviting me to his home for dinner that Saturday. I was stunned into silence for a moment. A 2-star general inviting a staff sergeant to his private home for dinner was almost unheard of. It was a breach of every unwritten rule of military protocol that separated the enlisted from the officer corps. My first instinct, born of 12 years of ingrained deference, was to find a polite excuse to decline. But then I realized this wasn't about rank. This wasn't a general summoning a subordinate. This was something else entirely. This was personal. I'd be honored, sir, I found myself saying. General Roth's house was miles away from the rigid, imposing architecture of Fort Bragg. It was a single-story ranch house on a quiet, tree-lined street in a peaceful suburb. The kind of place you'd see in a movie about small-town America. It had a neatly mown lawn, a flower garden bursting with late summer blooms, and a classic wooden porch swing. It was a home, not a headquarters. The general himself opened the door. He was wearing jeans and a simple blue polo shirt. He looked like someone's dad, not the commanding officer of thousands of soldiers. The weight of his rank seemed to have been left at the office. "Kelly," he said with a small, genuine smile. "Glad you could make it. Come on in." His wife, a woman with a warm, kind face and gentle eyes, greeted me in the entryway. She took my hand in both of hers. "Lauren," she said, using my first name. "Thank you for what you did for our Evan." "Thank you." Her sincerity was so overwhelming I could only manage a quiet, "Of course, ma'am." Dinner was a relaxed, comfortable affair. We sat around a simple wooden dining table, and they served pot roast with potatoes and carrots, a classic, comforting American meal that felt a world away from the mess hall. We didn't talk about Briggs, or Vance, or the investigation. We talked about Ohio, where I was from. We talked about baseball. He was a long-suffering Cleveland Indians fan, and I ribbed him about my Cincinnati Reds. We talked about the meals my mother used to make. For the first time in months, sitting in that warm, softly lit dining room, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a family home, I felt like I could finally breathe. The armor I'd been wearing for so long, the constant state of high alert, began to melt away. After dinner, the general and I sat out on the back porch, sipping iced tea as crickets chirped in the twilight. His wife had left us, giving us space. For a long time, we just sat in comfortable silence, looking out at the dark silhouette of the trees in his backyard. "I was wrong, Kelly," he finally said, his voice low and contemplative. "I got too far from the ground. I was up in the stratosphere, reading reports, listening to my officers, and I let myself believe that everything was fine." He sighed, a heavy sound filled with regret. "I should have seen the rot sooner." "Evan." He opened my eyes, "And so did you." He turned to look at me, and in the dim porch light, I saw that the general was gone. In his place was a father, his eyes filled with a gratitude that humbled me. "You reminded me of a truth I'd forgotten," he said. "That sometimes the lowest-ranking soldier on the line has a stronger moral compass than my entire command staff." He let that sink in before he continued. "Briggs has been relieved of command," he said, the words matter of fact. "Vance is facing a full-blown internal investigation. He's finished, but removing a few bad apples isn't enough. We have to fix the tree itself." He reached over to a small side table and picked up a blue folder, handing it to me. On the cover, in bold letters, were the words, "Project Samaritan, a proposal for a direct integrity reporting channel." My heart began to beat a little faster. "This is my idea," he said, "but an idea is useless without the right person to lead it. I need someone who understands the problem from the inside out, someone who's seen the system fail and has the courage to make it right, someone the soldiers will actually trust." He looked at me, his gaze steady and clear. "I want that person to be you." I stared at the folder in my hands, then back at him, speechless. This wasn't just a promotion. This wasn't a reward. It was a recognition. It was a mission. It was a purpose. In that quiet moment on that peaceful back porch, with the scent of freshly cut grass in the air, I knew I had found my reason to stay. My new office, the headquarters for Project Samaritan, had a large window. After months spent in the suffocating silence of the basement, that window felt like the greatest luxury in the world. It looked out over the main parade ground, and I could see the soldiers marching, the Humvees rolling past, the daily pulse of life at Fort Bragg. I was no longer buried beneath it. I was a part of it again. With the new office came a new rank. I was Sergeant First Class Kelly now. But the change was more than just a new title or a room with a view. The entire atmosphere on the base felt different. The heavy, oppressive silence that had followed the initial incident had been replaced by conversation. In the mess hall, soldiers were actually talking, not just whispering. The younger privates walked with their heads held a little higher, a little less fear in their eyes. The fear of a system that would chew them up and spit them out had lessened, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. A few of the soldiers who had actively avoided me, the ones who had passed the salt shaker as if I were invisible, now went out of their way to greet me. A morning sergeant here, a respectful nod there. One of them, a young specialist, even stopped me to ask for advice about re-enlistment. He didn't mention what had happened. No one ever did. But I saw a new kind of respect in his eyes, not just for my rank, but for what I had done. I wasn't the snitch anymore. I was the one who had dared to speak up. A few months into my new role, General Roth asked me to speak to the latest graduating class of new recruits. I stood on the auditorium stage, looking out at the sea of hundreds of young, eager faces, their uniforms crisp, their futures stretching out before them. I didn't talk to them about regulations or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I didn't lecture them about protocol. Instead, I told them a story. I told them about a nameless soldier who was once faced with an impossible choice: follow a direct order or follow their conscience. I talked about the heavy price of silence and the immense power of a single voice speaking the truth in a room full of people who refused to hear it. I ended my speech by looking out at all those hopeful faces. "This uniform doesn't grant you power," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It grants you responsibility. The responsibility to protect the person to your left and the person to your right, not just from the enemy on the outside, but from the darkness that can sometimes grow on the inside. Be brave enough to be the leader you would want to follow." One afternoon, a letter arrived at my office. It was a real letter, on paper, with a postmark from Fort Benning, Georgia. It was from Evan. He was a second lieutenant now. He wrote about the challenges of officer candidate school and how he was trying every day to become the kind of leader his future soldiers could trust. Near the end of the letter, he had written a line that made my breath catch in my throat. "Every time I have to make a tough call, a decision where the right answer isn't clear, I find myself asking one question. What would Sergeant Kelly do? Thank you for being my compass." Tucked inside the envelope was a photograph. It showed Evan standing at attention in his new officer's dress uniform, the gold bar of his rank gleaming on his shoulders. The innocent, goofy smile he had in the picture on his father's desk was still there, but now it was tempered with a new confidence, a new resolve. I pinned the photograph to the bulletin board on my wall, right next to my window, where I could see it every day. The culmination of it all came during a formal battalion awards ceremony. At the end of the ceremony, my name was called. General Roth himself walked onto the stage. In front of the entire unit, he took the new rank insignia for Sergeant First Class and personally pinned them onto my uniform collar. He didn't make a long speech. He just leaned in close, his voice a quiet whisper meant only for me. "My father would have been proud of you." When I turned to face the formation, I didn't see the suspicious, resentful eyes that had haunted me for weeks. I saw admiration. I saw hope. I saw the beginning of something new. Later, when I received a copy of the official commendation for my permanent file, I noticed something unusual at the bottom. Below the official typed paragraphs, there was a handwritten note from General Roth himself. It read, "A leader's worth is not measured by the rank they hold, but by the positive change they create." Everything had changed. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally home. A year passed. Project Samaritan, the small initiative born out of a quiet conversation on a back porch, had become a success story. It was implemented, tested, and proven to be so effective that it was now being used as a model for similar programs on bases across the country. My role in its day-to-day operations was done. I had handed the reins over to a capable young officer, and at my own request, I'd returned to the training division. It was where I felt I belonged, where I could make the most difference. But this time, I taught things differently. I still taught them how to shoot, how to navigate by compass, how to field strip a rifle in under 60 seconds. But I also taught them other things. I taught them how to listen, truly listen, to the soldier next to them. I taught them when and how to speak up. I taught them that their primary duty was to be decent human beings first and effective soldiers second, because you could never be the latter without first being the former. One day, I was at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, waiting for a delayed flight back home to Ohio for a weekend visit with my parents. I was standing in a crowded terminal, staring absently at the departures board, when I heard a familiar voice. "Sergeant Kelly, is that you?" I turned, and my eyes widened in disbelief. It was Chief Morales. He looked 10 years younger, with a healthy Florida tan and a relaxed smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was in a loud Hawaiian shirt and khaki shorts. He looked happy. He looked free. Before I could even respond, he closed the distance between us and wrapped me in a warm, surprising hug. "I read about you," he said, pulling back, his voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt pride. "About the project. You did it, kid. You really did it. You did the thing we were all too damn scared to do." Our conversation was brief. His flight to visit his grandkids in Denver was boarding. But that chance encounter, in the anonymous rush of an airport terminal, was a powerful reminder that the ripples of my actions had spread far beyond the confines of Fort Bragg, far beyond the people I knew. The circle truly closed a few months later. Second Lieutenant Evan Roth received his first duty station orders. He was assigned back to Fort Bragg, this time as a platoon leader. On his first day, he came to find me. We walked together across the same parade ground where my story had begun, the place that had once been his personal hell. "It's different now," he said, looking around, his officer's uniform immaculate. "The whole atmosphere. People talk to each other. They look out for each other. Because of you." He told me that during one of his first leadership training sessions with his new platoon, he had told them a story. An anonymous story about a staff sergeant who had risked everything to do the right thing for a young private. He said he used it to teach them about moral courage. The circle was complete. The victim had become the protector. The lesson had been passed on. My story was no longer just mine. It was now a part of his and a part of theirs. Tonight, I find myself standing on the same wooden dock by Smith Lake where I sat a year ago, lost and hollow. The water is just as still, the stars just as brilliant. The scene is identical, but the feeling could not be more different. The emptiness is gone, replaced by a deep and profound sense of peace. I don't feel like a hero. I feel like a soldier who simply tried to do the right thing and then tried to do the next right thing after that. Looking back, I realize that true honor isn't found in a perfect service record or in blind obedience to the chain of command. Honor is the quiet, stubborn courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it means you have to stand alone. I think about Evan, now leading his own soldiers. I think about General Roth, a good man who was brave enough to admit he was wrong. I think about Chief Lamb and her quiet strength, and Chief Morales and his last-minute act of courage. I think of all the silent, unseen soldiers whose voices I was privileged to represent. And standing here, under the vast, quiet sky, I finally understand the ultimate truth of my journey. Sometimes it's not we who save the story. It's the story that saves us. And that's where my story finds its peace. Thank you for walking this path with me. I learned that one person's story, one person's courage, can become a source of strength for another. Perhaps yours can too. If my journey has moved you, please consider sharing it with someone in your life who might be fighting their own silent battle, someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters. To help the Chosen Revenge channel continue its mission of bringing meaningful stories to light, your support makes all the difference. Please like this story, subscribe for more, and thank you for listening.